in the possession
Or
of that
might
individual.
take the firearms first and then go to court, because that's another system. Because a lot of times, by the time you go to court, it takes so long to go to court to get the due process procedures. I like taking the guns early, like in this crazy man's case that just took place in Florida. He had a lot of firearms. They saw everything. To go to court would have taken a long time. So you could do exactly what you're saying, but take the guns first, go through due process second.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good to have you back, Dr. Paul.
Oh, very good. It's good to be back and ready and raring to go. Wish we had some very good news for everybody, but we're going to be talking about a problem that came to our attention. We've been talking about school shootings, and media is, engulfed with it. But there was a major meeting yesterday, at the White House, and the president was there, of course, and he had significant Republicans and significant Democrats. So it was bipartisan, so you can expect our problems to be solved, because as soon as they get together, they come together, and liberty is always promoted when it's bipartisan. Being facetious, obviously, because I think that is the detriment of the country, is too many things are bipartisan, and too often they agree to making things worse, whether it's spending, going to war, or printing more money. This bipartisanship is an endorsement of a bad philosophy, and I think that's what happened yesterday. But I think the shocker was the president came down on the side of more regulation. I believe he's contradicting what he alluded to in his campaign, and he was endorsed by the NRA, I believe, and all of a sudden he's taking on the NRA, conservatives, the Second Amendment, and it's pretty amazing. I cannot see how this is a strategically beneficial move for him, and I think he's wrong politically and constitutionally to say that this is a reason why we have to have more regulations, because sometimes there are bad things that happen. Matter of fact, bad things seem to happen frequently. But putting this in perspective, this isn't, and it's not like there's an epidemic that we went through, but there's an epidemic of the people who take advantage of this, because when people die, it's very easy to become very emotional and not objective. And when it comes to guns in schools, I think what happens, it really brings out the authoritarian demagogues. Any chance they have to have an answer to a problem with more authoritarianism, more government, less liberty, I think this fits that category.
And there sure were a lot of gasps when he was sitting there. Here's Feinstein on one side, Cornyn from Texas on the other. And he says, you got to get the guns first. Grab the guns first, then we'll worry about due process later. And Feinstein, of course, was giddy. She was giggling. She was thrilled. Cornyn had a pretty stone face, and he's not exactly the most conservative. And then you could say this was kind of a gaffe. He shot from the hip, his instincts, take the guns first, due process later. But even if it was a shot from the hip, even if it was him thinking outside, his mouth running before his brain was running, it does show something that I think you've said all along, which are his instincts. He has authoritarian instincts.
Yeah, and Senator Ben Sasse brought that up to him. He confronted him. He didn't back down. And, of course, he has challenged the president before. But I think his short statement that he made is worth reading, because he was confronting the president right to his face. And this is what Senator Sasse said. He says, quote, "Strong leaders don't automatically agree with the last thing that was said to them. We have the Second Amendment and due process of law for a reason. We're not ditching any constitutional protections simply because the last person the president talked to today doesn't like them." Now, I think the president's been, people have accused him of that in the past, but this is pretty serious, and he really catches them here. But it's to me sad that it works that way. He doesn't come from a systematic, fundamental belief in anything. It's all over the place, and it can be both places too. You know, have it one day one way, one day the next day, and now here's another flip-flop on them. It's interesting to see what this does. You know, he's already announced he wants to be president for another 7 years, so I can't imagine this won't start nibbling away at some of the people that really got excited about him with his populism.
Yeah, you mentioned even early on the political downside of this. I can't imagine. You've got the left is seethes with hatred toward him, and unfortunately in many cases irrational hatred, because they don't even talk about his policies. They don't like his hair. They don't like the way he looks. They think that Russia is under his bed or something. They seethe with hatred. The so-called moderates hate him. A lot of the neocons hate him. The Bill Kristol types hate him. He's got a group of, what Hillary called the deplorables, and he's been their champion, and they've been attracted, and they like guns.
Yes.
And they're law-abiding people for the most part, too. So undermining that base is politically insane.
And they touched on several specifics, the assault weapons ban, and this whole idea that you take your guns first and due process comes later. That is something else. And when he made that statement, it reminded me of how the system has worked. What about the NDAA? This authority that's been around, and Trump didn't invent it.
Yeah.
This was in the Bush era. The NDAA, you arrest people, and then Obama extended that. You can kill Americans, assassinate Americans, and deal with the due process later. And sometimes people get arrested, and if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and you don't get charged and you don't get a trial, you can get put in prison in Guantanamo or some other place, for life, essentially. So that attitude is very bad, and it's the rejection of the principle that the founding fathers tried to give us regarding guns and defending ourselves. And they weren't wishy-washy. Sometimes liberals will try to say, well, the Second Amendment means that the militia is allowed to own guns, which is a bunch of baloney. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Yeah. The purpose being so that you can participate in a militia which provides for your safety and security in a local way. But I think there's been court cases that sort of has refuted that and say it is an individual liberty. But when you come along and get people ready to write these regulations, I think they forget this. And it'll be sad if they have an erosion of that and going back to this thing where they're going to regulate one type of gun without really dealing with the issue of whether or not the people have a right to defend themselves.
Yeah, it's funny actually, because ironically Trump was right. Due process, who cares about due process? And you're right, the NDAA is an example, FISA is an example. There's no due process. They just vacuum up all of our communications. How many other examples? So, ironically, he is right. The due process, who cares about it?
He also had a statement about, what about this thing about the police? The cops have the right to stretch the law? Yeah. That, of course, it really invites a lot of problems, too.
We already have those kinds of problems, and I think he suggested that the police should have leeway above and beyond what the law gives them to take away people's guns if they think that person is a bad person. Yeah. So that is dangerous.
I think the other assumption is that the big picture is who's responsible for safety? And our country has gotten to the point where it's the government's job to make us safe and secure, that you have a safety net and you are protected. There's a policeman on every corner and we're all going to be safe and secure. But, if you carry that through, and many of them do, just think of how many things that they have on their plate. Because it looks to me like there's not, the crisis that we have is serious, and you can't belittle it. But compared to even assaults and killing in schools, it hasn't been getting worse.
Yeah, and this is something that's interesting. This came out just a couple of days ago, February 26th. It's a study by James Allen Fox, who's a professor of criminology, law, and public policy at Northeastern University. And he just simply looked at statistics. And he gave a list, people can look it up, a list of where he went for statistics. And he discovered that school shootings have actually been on a steady decline since the 1990s. So there's a lot of hype in the press, for a reason, for propaganda reason. But he said 4 times the number of children were killed in schools in the early 90s than are killed now in schools. And he also found that more kids are killed in bicycle accidents and pool drownings than shootings. So this is being exploited.
And there was no increase when assault weapons were legalized.
Yeah, because Columbine, I guess, was when the assault weapons were illegal.
And
It didn't have any effect.
The whole thing. But it's Pandora's box, really, is what they open up when government's there to make us safe and secure. What if you come up with a statistic to show that a lot of people get killed when they drive their automobiles over 60 miles an hour,
Yeah.
in a theoretical sense? If that were the case, why wouldn't the answer be to put a governor on the car?
Yeah.
Don't let anybody drive over 60 miles an hour. By that time, the people would probably rebel.
Yeah.
You know, that's going too far.
Especially in Texas.
We don't. I don't think we need that much safety around here. But there are so many things that government does get involved in. You know, they're always involved in nutritional advice, and it's always a disaster. You know, since the Food and Drug Administration been around, you know, we've had worse foods put on the marketplace, and it's the private market, the holistic type people who introduces the notions to some of the nutritional product. What if they decided sugar was bad for us? Which for some people it's bad for us. But what do we do? We give protectionism to sugar, so that we keep the cheap sugar out, and we get in there. We get involved in the sugar business, and then a lot of people suffer the consequences. There are so many things that if they were. I hate to mention they ought to be consistent. No, I don't want them to be consistent. They're liable to be consistent.
Yeah.
Think, oh, we have a lot more work to do, so therefore we have to have more and more regulation. Here they're saying that we have this problem, it's emotional, it's horrible, we need more regulations that's going to solve the problem. And I think my bottom line is, if you resort to regulations, you'll probably create more problems, you'll undermine liberties, and you will not solve the problem of the shootings. Your statistical report there, I think, verifies that.
And Professor Fox is interesting because who did this study. You read what he wrote. He's not against gun control. Matter of fact, he's in favor of gun control. He strikes me as kind of a typical liberal professor. But here's what he said. He's in favor of gun control, but he says, in these measures, they will not prevent school shootings, these kind of measures that they're talking about, because they're already very, very rare. He says this kind of school shooting, these mass shootings, are so rare that these additional measures won't do anything to prevent them.
I can't help but think that it's much more difficult to provide safety in a school. The bigger it is, I think, the more difficult it is. You know, and the schools are so big and gigantic. And just, and I don't know whether it could be verified by statistics, but I would think a school that has 300 people would be easier to manage than one that has 3,000.
Yeah.
I think if you have 300, everybody knows everybody by their first name. And of course, the other example when it comes to schools is, you know, private schools, you don't read or hear about this. And of course, some people argue that when you put up a sign as a gun-free zone, that might motivate them. I never know whether they have proof of that, but it certainly looks that way, that usually when there's no guns, we end up seeing some of these mass shootings. But I think it's tragic that this happens, because I happen to believe that some of the private industries and private schools and all, it's not like they don't care. They usually have some type of protection, you know, that they can provide. So even, I was just sort of pondering the thought, what if you did have a big school? And instead of depending on the sheriffs, that you wonder, you know, are they qualified and will they really, you know, defend the kids and this sort of thing? What if there were private groups that go in there? They do it for industries,
yeah,
and they do a pretty good job. I would visualize if you had a private security force, and they were responsible for the security of these schools that they could hit, they would be rewarded. You know, they're getting paid to do it, and maybe more people would want them, and they would have a strong motivation. But I don't think we're on the move. You know, it's likely to happen, but I think it's worth thinking about, because you know, private industry a lot of times can do a better job than the bureaucrats, and certainly the bureaucrat who wants more laws. I just don't think that's the answer, especially when it so explicitly violates one of the most straightforward amendments we have to the Constitution. They just want to throw this out. But this is real challenging because a few years ago, I was under the impression that the Democrats don't even talk about guns anymore because they always lose the fight, and then all of a sudden it's up front, and it's a big issue again. But what did we see in the papers after this happened? When the dust settled for about one day, then they had a gun show or a gun store, and more people there than ever.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, what were you hearing on TV? 78% of the American people want more controls and get rid of the guns and more registration, which was more of that propaganda, by the far left, and it had nothing to do with really caring. And my other argument that we've made before, if they really care about the children, they would think about how many children die at the hands of our foreign policy, whether it's the drones and the bombs we drop on them or the sanctions that we put on them. I mean, that is what they would have to care about if they really care about children who suffer the consequence, and those who start suffering the consequence of guns and bullets and bombs, government. Yeah. So, and if you compare that to a decreasing amount of school violence here locally, then the real problem is so often government guns when you look at it as a worldwide event.
And the other proposal now is to prohibit those between 18 and 21 years of age from purchasing what they call assault rifles, just high capacity rifles. But here again, Professor Fox says, in the past 35 years, there have been only 5 cases where someone between the age of 18 and 21 used an assault rifle in a mass shooting. So very, very rare, 35 years, only 5 cases. Our old coworker, Penny Langford, posted something on Facebook today, and she pointed out, if you do this, you're going to prevent every young gal on a college campus who may want to have a handgun to protect herself from having a gun. And how vulnerable if someone who's trained, someone who can protect themselves, that seems a very, very unfair thing to do.
Yeah, they talk about the equalizer for women. A little pistol in their purse certainly makes them an equalizer to some thugs on the street.
Yeah.
So I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. I imagine this issue will be around for a while. I think it has to be dissected out in a practical manner, whether the stories and the statistics you hear are correct, and also to look at it in a practical way of do more regulations really help, and also in the area of rights. Who has a right to own a gun and protect themselves, and does it help to undermine that right? Obviously not. I think the founders were right. The right to own and use a weapon, that right should not be infringed. And I believe the country would be better off, and the founders certainly believed that that would be the case, and that's why they gave us the Second Amendment. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.